Hello and welcome to this DairyXNet informational video presentation. I am Dr. Robert Van Saun, Extension Veterinarian with Pennsylvania State University and a member of the DairyXNet Program Committee. The video today is continuing our series of a very important topic of farm safety and farm worker safety. And our presenter is a return presenter, Dr. Dennis Murphy. He provided an informational video on worker safety previously, which is archived on the DairyXNet website. Dr. Murphy's presentation today will further elaborate on worker safety and health. You'll first learn why it's important to maintain a safe environment, and then Dr. Murphy will walk you through how you can implement a worker safety program, from policies to training, hazard identification to prevention and control. Learn how you and your clients can make a safer farm environment for everyone. Before we get started, I just again remind you that all of our informational videos and previous presented webinars are available, archived and available on our website. If you'd like to get more information from DairyXNet, you can like us on our Facebook page, you can sign up for our newsletter, or you can follow DairyXNet on Twitter. Our presenter today is Dr. Dennis Murphy. Dr. Murphy is the nationwide insurance professor of agricultural safety and health and extension safety specialist at Penn State University. He received his PhD from Penn State University and master's and bachelor degrees from Illinois State University. Dennis provides direction and leadership for agricultural safety and health research and extension projects at Penn State and teaches the course Safety and Health in Agriculture and Biorenewable Industries. Current program areas include applied research and education for tractor and machinery safety issues, youth safety, classification of agricultural deaths and injuries, agricultural safety and health management, methods of modifying farm worker safety behavior, biomass production safety, confined space manure storage safety, and responding to farm injury emergencies. We're very pleased to have Dennis with us and present this very important information.
Welcome to this webinar on managing worker safety and health on dairy farms. This presentation will take about 30 minutes, and I'll touch on the rationale for dairy operators proactively managing workplace hazards and risk. I'll discuss some principles of injury prevention that are directly related to managing hazards and risk. I'll also identify the several components that make up a good safety and health management plan. We'll review several of the tools that are available to operationalize these components, and then I'll end with a source for more information on this topic. Unfortunately, too many dairy farmers wait until something bad has happened before they act decisively about safety. Headlines like these are way too common and involve owner-operators, hard workers, and children. Manure-related incidents seem to get most of the national level attention, but tractors, feed grinders, augers, silos, and bulls cause a significant number of fatal and serious injuries across the country. At its most fundamental level, safety is driven by humanitarian concerns. That is, a concern for ourselves, which is self-preservation, and a concern for others. There are not many things worse than knowing something that you did or did not do contributed to the death or crippling injury to another person. This is especially true in ag because that person is likely to be family or friend. But the risk of injury isn't the only reason smart dairy farmers pay attention to hazards and ways to mitigate and control them. Injuries cost money. Hopefully everyone understands this. Sometimes you can see very directly how a specific incident costs your business dollars. For example, insurance premiums or deductibles go up. You have medical bills to pay that are not covered by insurance, or you are fined and or sued because of an injury incident. As shown recently in New Mexico, past exemptions, including involving workers' comp coverage for farm workers, is increasingly disappearing. This New Mexico case did involve a dairy worker. A couple of states have targeted dairy farms through OSHA local emphasis programs. and a Google search will find several websites like the one on the right-hand side. But while you can easily add up the dollars of an incident because of direct cost, all the incidents actually cost you much more through some fairly subtle and indirect ways. These are the kind of indirect costs that most farm operators are not aware of. But these kinds of costs are often estimated to be anywhere from 1 to 4 times the direct cost of an incident. Farmers often pay injured workers who are not working just because you care about your workers and their families. While many operations shut down for a few to several hours or even a day or two after something serious, a dairy farm will still need to get the cows milked. But if there are new volunteers doing the milking, a delay in milking time, and or a lot of commotion going on around the cows, they will not be as productive as normal. And while you may not realize it, a dairy operation can get a reputation, either good or bad, based on what happens at the farm. When a fatal or a serious incident happens, an operation has multiple incidents over a period of time, word can spread that this is not a particularly good or safe place to work. On the other hand, a visible and active worker safety and health program can get you a reputation as the kind of place workers want to be at. To be effective in managing worker safety and health, you need to embrace some underlying principles that govern injury prevention in all fields of work. The first of these is that injuries have identifiable causes, which are either preventable or controllable. They are not random acts of a higher power, and rarely are they just bad luck. We make decisions and choices about our work behaviors, our risk-taking, the products we purchase and use, how we maintain them, the environment we work in, and on and on. The good news about this principle, though, is that if injury causes are identifiable, then we can also prevent them or at least control them in the future. Another principle is that injury incidents normally derive from multiple causes rather than just a single cause. We often attribute incidents to human behavior because it is always easy, with hindsight, to see what a person could have done differently to have avoided the incident. And because we can see that it could have been avoided, let's say by putting a guard on a machine, taking more time to move the cows, using only tractors with ROPS, or maybe not riding extra on tractors, we stop looking for other ways of prevention. But there are always underlying reasons that contribute to how we think and act in the heat of the moment. So we need to dig deeper and to find those contributing causes, because that will provide you with more opportunities to prevent a reoccurrence. A third principle is that hazards and risk are everywhere, but we are not very good at perceiving or at judging just how risky a specific action is at a specific point in time. It is impossible for individuals to be consciously aware of, respond to, and fully understand all of the risks they face in life. I think that what is most important to understand about this principle is that most times when we engage in risk-taking, it does not result in an injury. For instance, a person is not entrapped every time they step under a raised bucket on a skid steer, and a person does not suffer an injection of hydraulic fluid into their bloodstream every time they use a bare hydraulic line. And because we don't suffer negative consequences from every time we take a chance, we begin thinking that the hazards we encounter on a regular basis aren't all that serious and will probably never actually result in an injury. So let's start exploring how to manage hazards and risks just like you manage other important variables in running a successful dairy operation. These are the primary components of any good safety and health management plan. Let's look at each component to see how it can fit as a part of your efforts to actively manage hazards and risk and to provide worker safety and health on your dairy farm. Management leadership means showing employees that you care about their safety and health as they go about their work and take steps to achieve a safe working environment. An owner-operator is the one that sets the standard for how workers think about and handle hazards and risk in the workplace. Managers create and support a culture of safety among workers. If you have enough workers to have one or more supervisors, They need to be a part of the leadership team by making sure that the safety program is implemented and carried out. It is critically important that owners and supervisors model safety behaviors and follow all safety rules that are in place for workers. When it comes to safety, talk is cheap. Everyone, including the leaders, have to walk the walk when it comes to safety. Safety program leadership is about building relationships, communications, trust, and credibility that motivates your workers to follow and enforce safety procedures because it is the right thing to do. One of the most important things to have is a written safety policy. An effective safety policy has several important characteristics. It will have a section that expresses your commitment to safety as a company value. It will contain safety goals and express ways to achieve those goals. It will state who is responsible for what and give authority to meet those responsibilities. It will establish rules that apply to everyone. It has a statement to confirm that employees have seen and understand the safety policy. And then it will have signature lines for the employee and manager that bears witness to the policy. Worker participation means workers are involved in establishing, operating, evaluating, and improving the safety and health program. There are any number of ways to have workers actively engaged in the safety program, and several are shown on the slide. It is really important that employees feel comfortable providing input and reporting safety or health concerns, and that they have access to information that they need to participate effectively in the program. It is also critically important that workers do not experience retaliation when they raise safety and health concerns, report injuries, or exercise any of their rights under safety and health rules and regulations. An important point about having recognition and award programs. Be sure to always base them on positive safety behaviors, fixing hazards, compliance with safety procedures, and other similar good things, and not on not having injuries. Research from a number of fields suggests that employees will hide or not report injuries if award programs are based on an absence of injuries. And sometimes not reporting an injury can lead to disastrous long-term consequences for both the worker and the employer. Everyone is familiar with the need to identify hazards, but that really is only one part of a good plan in managing hazards and risk. You also want a way to identify what is most important to fix right away and what can be left for a reasonable period of time. These three functions tend to overlap and intertwine as opposed to being discretely different functions. Many people use simple hazard checklists to identify worksite hazards, but forms like this are very limited in the real world. Worksite hazards do not exist in a yes or no format, and a checklist like this does nothing to help you evaluate and prioritize hazards from the most hazardous to the least hazardous. Many people use the terms hazards and risk interchangeably, but they are not the same thing. Hazard has to do with the idea that something can harm you and is referenced as potential for injury or loss. And you can certainly understand that a tractor rolling over has a great potential for doing you serious harm. The word risk does imply consideration of hazards as a part of the meaning of risk, but doesn't actually define the term. Rather, risk considers how likely that hazard is to actually hurt you and how bad it may hurt you or how severely. Or saying it more simply, what are the odds of you being hurt severely? Here is the most common way that risks are assessed when considered by the odds that you might suffer a fatal or serious injury from a specific risk. Different levels of probability go down the table and severity or consequences go across so that you end up with a matrix such as you're looking at. And based on where a particular risk is placed, you see the suggestion for how you might react to it. Here's an example of how this matrix might be applied to risk associated with dairying operations. Every farm will be different, and not every cell needs to be filled in if it doesn't make sense to your operation. This kind of tool is helpful when you are first starting to identify and assess the risk you need to address. It also works best when you consider groups of risks that revolve around an operational segment as opposed to a single risk. For instance, this example is considering dairy operations, which includes manure pit operations, moving animals, running PTO-powered equipment, and handling hay bales. And it could have several more. But considering all of these activities as a group helps you prioritize what is really the most important thing to attend to, and maybe what can be left for a little bit later. But there are different risk matrices out there that you can find. This one was developed by the Farm and Ranch Safety and Health Association out of British Columbia, Canada. It has fewer probability categories, but that's okay as long as you define how you're going to interpret the categories. And here is a third example. This one is different from the other two in that it separates the exposure variable from the probability variable. This version is good when you have a lot of employees that have very different levels of exposure to hazards. Again, as long as you define how you interpret your variables, you can use whatever matrix or whichever matrix best fits your operation. Now, I want to go back to hazard inspection forms because all I've done to this point is tell you that forms only give you an option of yes, no, or maybe safe, unsafe, or satisfactory, unsatisfactory. And that's not very good or useful. So let's look at some forms that let you evaluate and rank hazards at the same time you identify them. Here's an example of a more objective and informative hazard inspection form. It identifies the hazard and has a rating scale that provides evaluative and ranking functions at the same time. A 1 is always the best or least hazardous scenario, and a 5 is always the worst or most hazardous scenario for that particular hazard. A scale like this also guides you as to what should be done to keep a hazard at a low level or how to remove or correct the hazard. And on a form like this, you can evaluate up to 5 PTO shafts at a time. Applying this type of hazard inspection form to machines, farm shops, manure pits or tanks, horizontal or upright silos, and other hazard areas on your farm would let you develop a hazard score for your entire farm operation. And here's a scale to help interpret the results of a farm hat type inspection. Because farm hat uses a numeric scale, it gives you a more objective and consistent result when used repeatedly over time. Here's another example of a hazard inspection form that performs all 3 functions that a good inspection form should do. This form adds specific work tasks to the consideration of the physical hazard that may be present. This form has fewer evaluative choices than the previous form or the farm hat form, and they are not numeric, so it may take more work to develop average scores, but still this is far better than a form that only gives you a choice of yes or no or safe or unsafe. And like the other form, it lets you know what to do to correct the hazard, which of course is always good. Okay, let's move on to some other tools that are available to help manage hazards once they've been identified and evaluated. There are 2 principles of hazard prevention and control that are really important to understand. The first is that injury incidents normally have 2 or 3 or more contributing causes beyond the most obvious cause. For example, when a person enters a manure pit and dies from toxic gas, the obvious cause is a lack of protection from the toxic gas. And the most obvious solution is to wear proper personal protective equipment, which in this case is a self-contained breathing apparatus or SCBA like firefighters wear. But also contributing to the fatal incident is the lack of gas detection equipment, lack of positive ventilation into the pit, lack of wearing a safety harness with lifeline attached to a mechanical advantage retrieval device, and the lack of a second person to assist in case of emergency. Any one of these contributing causes could have prevented the entry into the pit from resulting in a death. But if you don't go beyond the last most obvious action of the individual, you'll never discover all of these contributing causes that then lead to multiple ways to keep it from happening again. The second principle is that your selection of an injury prevention or control measure should not be based on the importance of causal factors. What this principle is saying is that just because a particular behavior is the kind is the thing that contributed the most to an injury incident, trying to prevent or change that behavior from occurring again may not be the most effective way to keep a similar incident from injuring another person in the future. For instance, farmers have forever hitched high to the rear of the tractor when trying to pull or drag a heavy object because it helps to lift the object at the same time it is being pulled, which often makes it easier to move. This is clearly an unsafe behavior. But instead of trying to convince the farmer not to do this, a more effective way of saving lives when a farmer goes to pull a heavy object is to make sure he or she is using a tractor with a roll bar and have a buckled seatbelt. This is a more effective way to save lives on farms than to rely on the tractor operator to always use best safety practice when hitching and pulling heavy objects. The second principle leads to a tool that helps guide a person as they think about options for eliminating and reducing hazards in the workplace. It is almost always easier to provide a worker with personal protective equipment to protect against the hazard, but that does nothing to eliminate or control the hazard itself. And it means that you're relying on the worker to always wear the PPE properly and when they need it. It is always more effective and permanent to apply the top three strategies than the bottom three strategies. It is often true that the elimination substitution options work together. For example, handling bulls can be hazardous, but cows have to be bred, so you can substitute AI for keeping a bull. But you don't always have to eliminate or substitute to get rid of a hazard. For instance, engaging the hydraulic lockout before anyone moves in close to speak with the operator would be a way of using engineering to eliminate the hazard of a bucket coming down unintentionally and crushing the person on the ground. Here's another tool called job safety analysis that combines hazard identification with safety training. When jobs are broken down in the JSA format, it gives you a tool that identifies each step of a job, the ways a person could get hurt while performing that step, and the right ways to do the step and job so that no one gets hurt. This is a tool that was developed in the industrial safety field and is a staple of companies that are recognized as leaders in worker safety and health. It is best developed by having 2 to 3 experienced workers actually going through the process of, say, lining up a wagon to dump a load of corn or silage into an auger, hopper, or on a conveyor belt. By writing down the steps, the potential hazards, and best safety practices, you not only have a tool for training new workers, but oftentimes find a more efficient or safer way to do the job. Okay, so let's look next at the education and training component to see some of the ways you might work with employees or even family members to encourage and support best safety practices. Now, before we look at specific training strategies, I want to be sure we have a common understanding of the term learning. As I use it in safety and health management, it simply means the process of acquiring knowledge or skill or modifying behavior by practice, training, or experience. I think this is a fairly straightforward definition. I want to start off with some basic learning principles that are really important to adult learning. People are almost always learning something because they are always observing what goes on around them and trying to make sense of it at some basic level. And as they are doing this, they are bringing their own life history and experiences into this sense of what is going on around them. The more you can engage a person to bring their own life experiences and history into what is going on around them, the more likely they are to become mentally engaged and willing to learn new things. When you are trying to teach safety, and if you start blaming workers for unsafe acts or for not following routine best safety practices, or saying that a particular injury incident was caused by this or that worker, your workers will become defensive and not receptive to learning. Blaming also has an air of finality that discourages further investigation of prevention strategies. For example, buckling a seatbelt on your tractor outfitted with ROPS would protect against injury during a rollover. But maybe there was inadequate training, or maybe limiting who operates a tractor in certain situations, or changing work procedures to not operate on steep terrains, etc., would also be preventive actions to take, but might never come to mind because everyone has already become defensive and sort of shut down. The last principle I will mention is that of positive reinforcement being more effective than negative reinforcement. Saying this another way, it is more effective to compliment a person for safe behaviors than being critical because of unsafe behaviors, particularly after the fact. For example, it is more effective to say, "It was great seeing you wearing your safety goggles this morning," than saying, "I noticed you weren't wearing your safety goggles this morning. That's not good and that needs to change." So the question becomes, how do you get your workers to become cognitively, emotionally, and physically engaged with learning new information? Well, one way is to use learning tasks. A learning task tries to integrate teaching and learning as a seamless activity. And you do this by structuring the way a group talks about topics so that specific learning takes place. And there are a couple of relatively inexpensive ways to do this. One simple way is to implement this type of training is to use news clippings of a farm incident and or maybe a newspaper clipping or magazine story about a specific farm safety issue. For example, here's a clipping of an incident involving a ruptured hydraulic line. The idea is to let workers read this story, and then you ask 3 to 4 very specific questions that will help them learn about locking out or blocking hydraulic equipment during maintenance. Here are the 4 questions that serve this purpose. Your goal as the instructor is to get the workers talking to each other and relaying their own experiences with this kind of activity. You can also do this with photos of incidents that may be available from various sources. These questions are structured to learn about general tractor overturn safety, but this is the kind of flexibility you have with this type of safety instruction. Learning safety task instruction can be done in 15-30 minutes with small groups of workers. Limiting the questions to 3 or 4 is usually sufficient, and you should try to get every person to respond or speak at least once. Again, because you're trying to get them engaged. It's important to understand that the goal of this technique is to get everyone talking and discussing the issue at hand, and in doing this, they don't necessarily have to agree with each other on every point that is made. But as the instructor, you should make sure that everyone leaves with the information or best safety practices that you want to get across in this safety program. Here is a specific training method called job instruction training that works well with job safety analysis. A JSA tells you what to teach, but the JIT helps with the how of teaching. Each step in the JIT is important for this technique to work, but step 3 is really the key. What is important about step 3 is that the worker has to repeat the steps of the instruction, including your explanation of why this is the safe way to do the job. A person that cannot repeat the instructions usually neither understands nor is likely to remember the instructions. Repeating the instructions helps them to internalize those instructions so that they can remember them and helps them to understand. To make JIT effective, you have to have instructors that not only know the right way to do the job, but have the skills to teach others. And it can only be done effectively in the worksite with real tools and equipment and enough time so that the workers aren't feeling rushed or pressured to learn. The benefits of job instruction technique are that the workers are involved cognitively, emotionally, and physically, which is what keeps them engaged in the learning. You can also correct mistakes by the learning and improving your own instructional techniques because you get results and feedback almost immediately. The final component I want to mention briefly is the importance of an annual program review. The purpose of the review, which is often referred to as an audit, is to see if you have been implementing your safety program as planned. For instance, checking on your policies, programs, procedures to make sure that there aren't any deficiencies and to provide direction for correcting deficiencies and making other improvements. These audits should be done at least once a year, but when you're first setting up your program, you may want to run through this process 2 to 3 times that first year or even first couple of years. And involving workers in your review is a great way to have them buy into the overall program. Particularly if you have a large operation and have several frontline supervisors, getting feedback from individual workers is really important. Record keeping throughout the year is important because this is what provides you with the documentation you need to do a safety audit or review. A popular saying in the safety world is that if there isn't documentation, it didn't actually happen. This applies mostly to safety training and hazard inspections and corrections. But in addition to the regular program documentation that you'll use for the audit, you need a way to show how you conduct your audit and the results of it. So let's look at a couple of ways that you might do this. You can organize a safety program audit form by the major components of your plan that are listed earlier, such as management leadership, employee participation, hazard inspection assessment, and on down the list. Or you can organize it by the major activities that would operationalize your program, such as hazard inspections, training programs, incident investigations, and the like. Or you can organize the audit by specific hazard or safety topics such as tractors, machinery and equipment, confined spaces, regulatory compliance, and on down that list. Here's a typical form based on program activities. It has 2 good characteristics that I strongly recommend. 1, it asks questions to be answered, and 2, it uses a scale for responses. Much like with the hazard inspection forms, scales allow for a more objective and detailed response than a dichotomous response that says just okay or not okay, or satisfactory or unsatisfactory. You can set your own scale as long as you define what those numbers mean. I want to finish this webinar by recognizing that this is the primary reference document for this webinar. It has many more details and examples about the topics that I've covered today, as well as some things that we didn't have time for, such as identifying a lot of the safety and health regulations that are relevant to dairy operations. This is the only non-commercial and publicly available document addressing farm safety and health management and planning that I am aware of. This completes this webinar. Feel free to contact me if you have questions or want additional detail on some of the areas and topics that I covered today. You can also find others related safety information and handouts on my website. Thank you very much for your time.